Chapters 11 and 12 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 11. 1800. The Question of Heredity. The winter season of 1800 in Paris was very brilliant. On the 26th January the new Minister of the Interior, Lucien Bonaparte, gave a grand ball in honor of his sister Caroline and her husband, at the magnificent Hôtel Brissac, Rue de Grenelle, which he occupied at the time. Dinners and balls, which recalled the fêtes of the fermiers généraux under the monarchy, were also given by the great bankers of the day. All classes of society took part in the social world, and the dance was never so popular. For a period of 10 years the Parisians had been deprived of the popular masked balls of the Opéra, and their reopening was one of the features of the Carnival. But while Paris danced and played, the First Consul was occupied with very serious problems. The internal affairs of France were in very bad shape. The treasury was empty. Civil war still raged in the Vendée. The soldiers were ill fed and ill clad, and the armies were demoralized from frequent defeats. The foreign situation was equally discouraging. The English government had declined his pacific overtures, and with Austria it was clear that there was no chance of peace except through victory. During the winter the energy and activity of Bonaparte were everywhere in evidence, and the sudden resurrection of France at this time is one of the most remarkable events in modern history. "Instantly, as if by enchantment," writes the English historian Alison, "everything was changed. Order reappeared out of chaos, talent emerged from obscurity, vigor arose out of the elements of weakness. The arsenals were filled, the veterans crowded to their eagles, the conscripts joyfully repaired to the frontier. La Vendée was pacified, the exchequer began to overflow. In little more than 6 months after Napoleon's accession, the Austrians were forced to seek refuge under the cannon of Ulm, Italy was regained, unanimity and enthusiasm prevailed among the people, and the revived energy of the nation was launched into a career of conquest." On the 6th of May Bonaparte left Paris for Italy. 2 weeks later he crossed the Grand St. Bernard. On the 2nd day of June he entered Milan. On the 14th he decisively defeated the Austrians at Marengo, and at one stroke regained nearly all of the territory in northern Italy which had been lost during his absence in Egypt. On his return to France Napoleon received a perfect ovation at every stage of his journey. When he entered Paris the night of the 2nd of July, after an absence of less than 2 months, the enthusiasm was indescribable. An innumerable crowd gathered in the Tuileries gardens to cheer him, and he expressed his pleasure to Bourrienne by saying, "The noise of these acclamations is as sweet to me as the sound of the voice of Josephine." 20 years later, on the rock of St. Helena, he spoke of this as one of the happiest days of his life. During Napoleon's absence occurred the so-called conspiracy of Marengo, the details of which are little known. While he was still engaged in putting down the civil war at home, and repelling the foreign invaders from the frontiers of France, his brothers Joseph and Lucien had already begun the struggle for the supreme power in the event of his death. The question of heredity, which was to be the source of his greatest troubles, and one of the causes of his final downfall, had already been raised before his supreme power was even definitely established. As early as the month of February, Lucien was exchanging views with Bernadotte, who during the Consulate and the Empire never lived a day without plotting to overthrow Napoleon. A month before the departure of the First Consul for Italy, in his cabinet at the Tuileries, Fouché, regarding Lucien with his terrible eyes, exclaimed, "I will have the Minister of the Interior himself arrested if I learn that he is conspiring." A contemporary who endeavors to find excuses for Lucien, and to defend him from the charge of conspiracy, is forced to admit that "the political immorality, the civil dishonesty of his administration, the disgraceful peculations, the insatiable cupidity of the agents by whom he was surrounded, did much to injure his brother's government." Joseph, for his part, acted much more discreetly, but he let his brother know that he wished to be designated as his successor. Nothing in the new Constitution gave this power to the First Consul, who had been elected for 10 years, and was re eligible. With his childish vanity, Joseph could see no reason why he should not be as acceptable to the French nation as the conqueror of Italy and Egypt, and thought that it only needed a word from Napoleon to amend in his favor a constitution adopted by the practically unanimous vote of 3,000,000 citizens. In a conversation with the First Consul the day before his departure for Italy, Joseph seems to have raised for the first time the question of the consular heredity, and he showed his hand more clearly in a letter written on the 24th of May. In all Corsicans there is a strong sentiment of the clan, from which Napoleon himself was not exempt. Joseph felt that as the eldest he was the chief of the clan, the head of the family. Therefore it was not a favor which he solicited, it was a right which he claimed. But he did not rely entirely upon the support of Napoleon to gain his point. Upon the suggestion of his friend Millot, a council was held at Auteuil, at which were present nearly all the leading members of the former assemblies. The possibility of the death of Bonaparte and the question of his successor were discussed. But the name of Joseph was not even mentioned. After wavering between Lafayette and Carnot, they decided in favor of the organizer of victory, whom Napoleon had recalled from exile and made Minister of War. At this same time an alliance was formed between Talleyrand and Fouché, which was to bear its full fruit 14 years later, when these two arch conspirators and underhanded enemies of Napoleon were to precipitate his fall and bring back the Bourbons. At this time, however, their plans only contemplated the formation of a triumvirate, consisting of themselves and one accommodating colleague. Lucien was not involved in any of these later schemes. On the 14th May he lost his wife, and for at least 10 years he retired to his country estate, abandoning entirely the direction of his department. In the meantime Joseph was so anxious to obtain an immediate response from his brother, that he could not remain quietly at Paris and set out for Italy. When he arrived at Milan, the victory of Marengo had settled the whole question. Napoleon was now the absolute master of France, and the decision of the matter was entirely in his own hands. He was fully informed of the plots and counterplots, but chose to ignore them all. The only outcome was that Carnot lost his portfolio. Leaving for Italy in the costume of the Institute, on his return Napoleon presides over the Council of State in the uniform of general. It is only after Marengo that he feels his place secure as head of state. It was not until the 7th of September that he finally and definitely replied to the proposals of the Pretender. "I have received, sir, your letter. I thank you for the polite things you say to me. You cannot hope to return to France. It would be necessary for you to march over 500,000 dead bodies. Sacrifice your interests to the repose and happiness of France. History will give you credit for your action." The conspiracy of Marengo is interesting because it marks the first grouping of factions which on several occasions were again to come to the front during the Empire; and because it reveals the principal weakness of Napoleon's personal regime. These plots convinced him of the necessity of providing for the consular succession. The new Constitution, perhaps intentionally, had left the matter in very vague shape. For the first time Napoleon now fully realized the necessity of facing this question of heredity, so important to himself, to his brothers, and above all to Josephine. Napoleon at the age of 31 could not abandon the hope of an heir. Hence the constant menace of divorce for Josephine, who after 4 years of marriage could hardly expect to bear another child. Her hope of a restoration of the Bourbons had now been extinguished by the action of her husband. In this dilemma she naturally sought the support of such former Jacobins as Fouché and Réal, who were opposed to the extension of the powers of the First Consul, and, above all, to the designation of his successor. As for Napoleon's brothers, they felt that there could be no question of their rights to the succession. One would think, as Napoleon once expressed it, that he, as the younger brother, had usurped the place and the rights of Joseph as successor to their father the late king. They were also so convinced that it was impossible for Napoleon himself to have any children, that they could not conceive of his repudiating Josephine and marrying a younger woman in the hope of having an heir. Lucien apparently recognized the rights of Joseph as the elder, and was willing to await his turn as heir presumptive, especially as his brother had no children. The two brothers therefore sought, each in his own way, to secure the adoption of the principle of designation, after which each one hoped to be chosen. With the death of his charming wife, Catherine Boyer, who, notwithstanding her common origin, had finished by gaining the love of all the family as well as the general esteem of society, Lucien had more and more neglected his official duties, and plunged into all kinds of dissipation. Napoleon was obliged to call him to account, and there were several unpleasant scenes between the brothers. Matters were finally brought to a head by the publication of the famous Parallèle. One morning, towards the end of October, Fouché entered the cabinet of the First Consul, and handed him a little pamphlet entitled Parallèle entre César, Cromwell et Bonaparte. 2 paragraphs were specially marked, which suggested the idea of heredity and pushed the candidacy of the brothers of the Consul. This brochure, written by Lucien, although he denied it, and widely distributed under the frank of the Minister of the Interior, had caused a great sensation in all the departments. Lucien is summoned from his country place, Plessis, and there is a violent scene between him and Fouché in the presence of the First Consul. Napoleon remains a passive spectator of the discussion. Josephine enters the room and takes part. She seats herself upon Napoleon's knees, and runs her fingers gently through his hair and over his face. "I beg you, Bonaparte," she says, "do not make yourself a king. It is this wretch Lucien who urges you to it. Do not listen to him." With much regret, Napoleon asked for Lucien's resignation, and to cover his disgrace sent him as ambassador to Madrid with an enormous salary. This exile in disguise of Lucien is not all that Josephine gains from the publication of the Parallèle, and the opportune intervention of Fouché. Napoleon is now fully convinced of the necessity of adopting the principle of the right of designation, but the choice of the individual presents many difficulties. He puts aside Joseph, a most worthy man, but with no application, and no capacity for public affairs. Lucien is now out of the question. For a moment he thinks of Eugène de Beauharnais, who would have been the best choice of all, but decides that he is too young and inexperienced. The next day he makes his decision. "It is not necessary," he says, "to cudgel our brains to find a successor. I have found one. It is Louis. He has all of the good qualities and none of the faults of his brothers." Josephine was delighted when Napoleon informed her of his choice, in which, unconsciously, he may have been influenced by his wife. "Louis has an excellent heart, a very superior mind," she said. "He loves Bonaparte as a lover loves his mistress." From that moment her plan was settled. Louis must marry Hortense. 12. 1800 to 1802. Marriage of Hortense. Louis Bonaparte, who was born on the 2nd of September, 1778, was 9 years younger than Napoleon, who regarded him very much in the light of an adopted son. In February, 1791, when Napoleon returned from his home in Corsica to his regiment at Auxonne, after an absence of nearly 17 months, he brought with him his favorite younger brother. On his meagre pay of 100 francs a month, he had undertaken this care in order to relieve to some extent the financial difficulties of his widowed mother. In his shabby little room with its sparse furniture there was no place for Louis, and he slept on a mattress in an adjoining cabinet. Napoleon himself prepared their frugal meals. He gave his brother lessons in mathematics, and generally supervised his education. At a later date he complained of his brother's ingratitude, and reminded him that for his sake he had deprived himself even of the necessaries of life. The blindness of Napoleon to the faults of his brothers and sisters is almost the only weak point in his character, as it also reveals one of the most attractive sides of his heart. He never could do too much for his family, who, almost without exception, repaid him with the basest ingratitude. They all seemed to think that their good fortune was due entirely to their own merits, and not at all to the senseless partiality of their great brother. In 1795 Napoleon procured for Louis admission to the military school at Châlons. At this time he wrote in the warmest terms of his brother's fine qualities of heart and mind. The following year Louis, who was then only 18 years of age, was one of Napoleon's aides de camp in Italy. He was his messmate, his private secretary, his man of confidence. At this time Louis was splendid company, always full of life and spirits. At Milan he contracted a disease which in a short time not only affected his health, but seemed to change his moral character. For the rest of his life he was a regular hypochondriac, constantly worrying about his health, and persuaded that he was doomed to an early death. During the Egyptian expedition, Louis again acted as aide de camp to his brother, but was sent back to France with despatches some time before the return of Napoleon. In January, 1800, when only 22 years of age, he was appointed chief of brigade. He then took up his residence in Paris, where he associated with men of letters, and occupied himself with everything except his military career. He took no part in the Marengo campaign, during which he remained at Paris, occupied with his literary pursuits. None of his friends seemed to understand the radical change in his character. Napoleon thought that a journey might rouse him from his melancholy, and proposed a trip to Germany, which Louis eagerly accepted, "to escape," he said later, "the solicitations for his marriage with Hortense." It is impossible, however, for us to believe that Hortense was so disagreeable, or the plans of Josephine so objectionable to him at this time as he tries to make out in his Reflections upon the Government of Holland, drawn up 20 years later. Even if Josephine, as early as August, 1800, had formed in her secret heart the project which she carried out a year later, she certainly had not made any moves which could arouse in Louis the apprehension that she had designs upon his independence. At that time Hortense was only 17 years of age. She was not very pretty, but was singularly attractive from the beauty of her form and the grace of her movements. Her nose was large, and her mouth ugly, with her mother's poor teeth, but her blonde hair and soft violet eyes gave to her face an expression of exquisite tenderness. The tout ensemble was one which attracted and fascinated everybody. She had been educated at the fashionable school of Madame Campan, and possessed all the accomplishments of a young lady of good family. She sang and danced well, she played the harp and the piano, she embroidered, she excelled in all the little tasks of the salon, she was quite literary in her tastes. She was a fine equestrian, and took a leading part in the sports and pastimes of the château life. In character she was very sweet and amiable, but became very obstinate when she was crossed. Her finest trait was her lifelong adoration of her mother, which, it must be confessed, Josephine had done little to deserve. After their return from Martinique, her mother had placed her at the age of 7 in a convent. When that was closed during the Revolution, she was apprenticed to a sempstress. Later she was practically abandoned for 4 years by her mother in the school at Saint Germain. On the few rare occasions that Josephine visited the school, she was prodigal in her demonstrations of affection, with her kisses which cost her so little, for this mother was coquette even with her children. Hortense regarded her mother as a wonderful being, and returned her affection 100-fold. In her innocence she knew nothing of her mother's worldly life, of her struggle for existence, of the connections she formed either from taste or necessity. She knew that her father was the Vicomte de Beauharnais, a handsome cavalier, who attended the Queen's balls, was President of the Constituent Assembly, General-in-Chief of the Army of the Rhine, and guillotined under the Terror. Her conception of her father's career was similar to that which we find in many of the histories, and equally far from the truth. She was proud of her name, one of the finest in France, and also of her mother, whom she considered worthy of her father. Hortense had therefore been much chagrined when her mother married an obscure Republican general of doubtful nobility, who had been absolutely unknown before the Revolution. She had only seen him once before the marriage, at a dinner given by Barras at the Luxembourg in January, 1796. Hortense, who was then not quite 13, had been taken from school for the occasion. She was jealous of the attentions to her mother of the little general, whose name she did not even know. She said, "He talked with great vivacity, and seemed only interested in my mother." She next saw Bonaparte for a few days only, on his return from Italy, and then again at the painful scene in the Rue de la Victoire, when she implored him to pardon her mother, without very clearly understanding what her mother had done. Under all the circumstances, would it not be strange if she had any love for her stepfather? Like most young girls, Hortense had a very sentimental side to her nature. She wished to marry for love, and to find love in her marriage. It has often been said that Duroc, the favorite aide de camp of Napoleon loved her, and that she reciprocated his affection. The First Consul had thought of him for one of his sisters. He certainly would have accepted him for his stepdaughter. Duroc was a gentleman, perhaps not of an illustrious family, but of better birth certainly than Bacciochi, Leclerc, or Murat. But Duroc was sent on a diplomatic mission to Berlin, and nothing came of this incipient love affair. With her usual selfishness, Josephine, in considering the partis who presented themselves, never thought of the happiness of her daughter, but only of her personal interests. But this was usual in those days. Her aunt, Madame Renaudin, certainly had not thought of Josephine's happiness when she married her to Alexandre de Beauharnais. Even if Josephine had not already made up her mind to bring about the marriage of Louis and Hortense, she would have been decided by the attempt to assassinate the First Consul on Christmas Eve, 1800. The conspirators knew that he expected to be present at the Opera that evening to hear the new oratorio of the Creation by Haydn, the most popular composer of the day. They expected that his carriage would take the usual route by the Rue Saint-Nicaise, which is no longer in existence. This was a long, narrow street bordering the Carrousel, and running from the Seine to the Rue Saint-Honoré, where it ended near the Rue Richelieu, in which the Opera was then situated. In this street an infernal machine, installed in a one-horse cart, was placed at a point which Bonaparte's carriage would pass, and the time that it would take him to come from the Tuileries was carefully calculated so that the machine would explode at the right moment. After dinner, Napoleon, who was fatigued from a hard day's work, had fallen asleep on a sofa, and was with difficulty aroused and persuaded to start by the ladies of the Tuileries, Josephine, Caroline, and Hortense, who did not wish to miss the performance. At 8 o'clock he set out, accompanied by Lannes, Bessières, and an aide de camp, and followed by a small escort of mounted grenadiers. The coachman, who had already begun his Christmas celebration, was half drunk, and drove at a furious rate. This fact alone saved Bonaparte's life. The carriage passed the infernal machine, and had just rounded the corner into the Rue Richelieu when the explosion occurred. Lannes and Bessières wished to stop, but Bonaparte ordered the coachman to proceed. A minute later he entered the loge with his usual calm face, and demanded a copy of the libretto. The life of Josephine was also saved by an incident equally trivial. She was wearing that evening, for the first time, a magnificent Oriental shawl presented to Bonaparte by the Sultan. Rapp, the aide de camp on duty, who was to escort the ladies, ventured to remark to Josephine that she had not arranged the shawl with her usual grace. At her request he showed her how the shawl was draped by the Egyptian ladies. The party then descended the staircase of the Pavillon de Flore, and entered their carriage. They traversed the Carrousel, and had just turned into the Rue Saint-Nicaise when the machine exploded. The windows of the carriage were shattered, and the arm of Hortense was slightly cut by a piece of glass. Rapp descended to see if the First Consul had been injured, and the carriage continued its way by another street. When the three ladies entered the box, Napoleon greeted them with a smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. The news of this dastardly outrage, in which over 15 people lost their lives, soon spread through the hall, and the oratorio was interrupted while the audience arose and frantically applauded the First Consul. A few minutes later the party left the Opera and returned to the Tuileries, where Bonaparte received the reports of the police and the congratulations of his ministers. This attempt on Napoleon's life was a terrible shock to Josephine. It gave new impetus to the public demand for an heir to the First Consul, as necessary to the security of the State; and this, for Josephine, aroused again the dreaded spectre of the divorce. This conspiracy, following so closely on that of Arena only 2 months before, which the police had discovered in time, convinced everybody that it was desirable to give the First Consul the right to designate his successor, and thus assure the heredity of the consulate, or at least the continued existence of the government as established by him. It was no longer an academic question to be debated and postponed from time to time, but an actual urgent public necessity, which demanded immediate action. Josephine realized that the crisis had come, and was more determined than ever to carry out her plan for the union of Louis and Hortense. If she herself could not give Napoleon an heir, he might find one in her grandchild and his nephew, the son of his favorite brother. Although Josephine did not live to see her dream come true, all of Napoleon's plans came to naught, and it was the son of Louis and Hortense who occupied the imperial throne as Napoleon III. Louis was already tired of his tour of Germany, and asked permission of his brother to return to Paris. No sooner was he back than the strange idea possessed him of buying a country place, where he went to bury himself in midwinter. The house which he purchased was a simple rural mansion, in the woods, a league from the highway, about midway between Mortefontaine and Plessis, the country estates of Joseph and Lucien. He had hardly taken possession of his new home, and begun some alterations, when he again became uneasy, and set out for Bordeaux to rejoin his regiment, which at his request had been included in the army of observation under the command of Leclerc, which was going to Portugal. In July, 1801, Josephine, who had not yet entirely abandoned all hope, went again to Plombières to take the waters, which the year before had succeeded so well in the case of Madame Joseph that, after 7 years of marriage, she was just on the point of presenting her husband with their first child. A month later, Josephine returned to Malmaison to await in vain the miraculous effects of her cure. At the end of 3 months Louis was tired of his military duties, and asked for a leave of absence. After spending several weeks at the Baths of Barèges to cure his rheumatism, at the end of September he came to Malmaison for a visit. There he fell in love with Hortense, and finally decided upon the marriage which he had previously dreaded. There is absolutely no truth in the statement so often made by Louis in after years that the marriage was forced upon him. 3 months elapsed between his return and the ceremony. During this period Louis showed himself very devoted to Hortense, while she seemed resigned to her lot. On the 3rd of January, 1802, the contract was signed at the Tuileries in the presence of the whole family, and the following day the civil marriage took place, followed the same evening by a religious ceremony at the Hôtel in the Rue de la Victoire. The nuptial benediction was pronounced by Cardinal Caprara, who was then negotiating the Concordat with the French government. At the same time Caroline and Murat, who had only been united by a civil bond, had their marriage blessed by the Church. Josephine ardently desired the same privilege, but Napoleon absolutely refused, either from reasons of public policy, or in order to keep the way open for a divorce if in the future he desired one. End of chapters 11 and 12.